Back in 1989, the United States launched this huge invasion of Panama. On the surface, it seemed pretty straightforward, a quick, decisive military op. But, when you start to peel back the layers, the story gets really complicated. So, let's get into it. So, the official name from the Pentagon was Operation Just Cause. Kind of sets a certain tone, right? But was it actually just? That's the big question here. The whole event really boils down to this. Was this a noble mission to save a democracy, or was it just a flat-out illegal war? Let's dig into the arguments on both sides. And when we say invasion, we're talking about a massive show of force. Just picture this. It's the middle of the night, and suddenly over 27,000 American troops are on the ground. We're talking stealth fighters, attack helicopters, the whole 9 yards. And they were up against Panama's defense forces, which only had about 16,000 troops. It was a total mismatch. The whole thing was pretty much over in a matter of hours.
Okay, so how on earth did things get to this point? To really wrap your head around this invasion, you've got to understand the guy at the very heart of it all, General Manuel Noriega. He was the man running the show in Panama. His relationship with the U.S. is just a wild ride. Look at this. Back in the 70s, he was actually on the CIA's payroll, a key asset, getting paid over $100,000 a year. But fast forward to the late 80s, and the picture's totally different. He's been indicted in the U.S. for drug trafficking, all while making himself a dictator back home. Then, in 1989, he just straight up cancels an election he lost. And then his government declares a state of war with the U.S. Talk about a complete 180. The guy went from trusted ally to public enemy number one.
And people in Washington knew things were going off the rails. Even a full year before the invasion, a Senate subcommittee basically said, hey, this whole Noriega thing is one of our biggest foreign policy screw-ups. It's pretty blunt. Their guy, their asset, had totally turned the tables on them, and it made the U.S. look, pretty foolish and weak.
So you've got years of this back and forth, drug charges, shady political moves, even some failed coups. It was like this pressure cooker, just simmering and simmering. And then, in December of '89, the lid finally blew off.
And this was the moment that changed everything. It was the spark. Just a few days after that state of war declaration, Panamanian soldiers shoot and kill an unarmed U.S. Marine, Lieutenant Robert Paz, at a simple roadblock. And to make things even worse, a Navy lieutenant and his wife who saw it happen, they were taken and beaten. For President George H.W. Bush, that was it. A line had been crossed that you just don't come back from. The very next day, he gave the green light. The invasion was a go. All right, so you're about to send nearly 30,000 troops into another country. You've got to have a good story, right? You need to sell this to the American people and to the entire world. So how did the Bush administration justify it? Well, they came out with 4 very specific reasons. Okay, here they are, the 4 pillars of their argument. Number 1, we've got to protect American citizens there. 2, we're there to defend democracy. 3, we need to fight drug trafficking. And 4, we have to protect the Panama Canal Treaty. On the surface, that sounds pretty solid, right? Almost noble. But the question is, does that argument actually hold up when you start looking at international law? And this, right here, is where things get super tricky. Because when you take those 4 reasons and you put them up against the actual rules of international law, a very, very different story starts to take shape. Let's take that first one, protecting American lives. It sounds like a no-brainer, but according to the UN Charter, you can only launch a massive military operation in self-defense if you've suffered an armed attack. And the counter-argument here was pretty powerful. As horrible as the murder of that one Marine was, it doesn't legally count as an armed attack on the entire United States. So, sending in 27,000 troops? Critics said that was a wildly disproportionate response. Okay, how about defending democracy? That's a great reason, morally speaking. Who doesn't want to defend democracy? But legally, it's a tough sell. There's this thing called the OAS Charter, the Organization of American States, and the U.S. is part of it. And it says, clear as day, that no country has the right to intervene in the internal business of another country. And it literally says, for any reason whatever. It's pretty cut and dried. All right, then there's the combating drugs angle, basically going in to arrest Noriega. Now, the U.S. had a valid indictment against him, but think about it this way. It's like your neighbor's police force breaking down your door to arrest someone in your house. It just doesn't work like that between countries. You can't just send your army into another sovereign nation to act as a police force. It's a huge violation of that country's right to exist as its own nation. And this last one, protecting the Panama Canal Treaty, this one is just dripping with irony. Get this. The very treaty that the U.S. was pointing to as a reason to invade, that same treaty had a section in it that specifically prohibited the U.S. from intervening in Panama's internal affairs. So their justification was literally undone by the very document they were using. You can't make this stuff up.
So, legally speaking, the U.S. case was on pretty shaky ground. But of course, the story doesn't end with a legal debate. To really get the full picture of Operation Just Cause, we have to look at what happened after the fighting stopped. And one of the most tragic and confusing parts of that legacy is the human cost. Just look at these numbers. The Pentagon said 202 civilians died. The United Nations said no, it was closer to 500. And then you have human rights organizations on the ground saying it could have been as high as 3,000 people. That huge difference tells you just how chaotic and brutal the fighting was in these crowded city neighborhoods. And this leads us to the biggest paradox of this whole story. It's a real head-scratcher. If you look at polling done inside Panama at the time, an incredible 92% of Panamanians actually supported the U.S. invasion. They were happy about it. But then you look at the rest of the world, and the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to condemn it as a flagrant violation of international law. So, how is that possible? How can the people on the ground see it as a liberation while the rest of the world sees it as an illegal act? It gets even more interesting when you look at it from today's perspective. Now we have this international principle called responsibility to protect. People call it R2P. And it basically says that if a government is harming its own people, the international community has a right, maybe even a duty, to step in. Now that concept did not exist back in 1989, but it makes you wonder, right? If R2P had been around then, would we be having a completely different conversation about the legality of this whole thing? And that really leaves us with the big, messy question at the heart of all this. What do you do when international law says one thing, but the people of a country are overwhelmingly begging for something else? It's this incredible clash between the rules written down in treaties, a nation's right to be left alone, and the desperate wishes of people living under a dictator. There are no simple answers here, and that's exactly why, all these years later, we're still talking about Operation Just Cause.